Good morning, sir.
Yeah, good morning, brother, and welcome. Am I audible?
Yes, sir, you are audible, sir.
I formally welcome you, Mr. Haq. Today I propose very important stage of our journey in understanding international refugee law and the protections, safeguards, challenges, and problems which we have been deliberating for long. Internal displacement constitute a very important segment that has not been properly addressed by the legal institutional framework at international level. At the same time, within the domestic sphere, it has not been properly addressed. There are certain important narratives which ultimately prevents and prevented in the past any international transparency, international accountability, and international law. So far, the question and problems confronted by the internally displaced people. There are certain important reports in the public domain regarding the preservation, protection, and promotion situations and ramifications of internal displacement. There are certain international organizations who have been functioning as the official repository of the data and analysis on internal displacement. Every year, these organizations have been publishing their reports, and these reports are addressing issues like climate change, natural disasters, human displacement because of climate change, human displacement because of development projects, and the practices, particularly the good practices from across the globe in advancing policy, displacement risk reduction, and effective legal institutional framework response. Therefore, in this kind of a scenario, it becomes very important to understand what is the global scenario of internal displacement. As of now, officially speaking, my dear friends, we are having the data which is available in the public domain. A well documented, well recorded data is there, and that has been recorded up to December 2020. If you take into account this year, 2020 data, and thereafter or this year, you will find there are as many as more than, unofficially speaking, 55.5 million new internal displacements across 150 nation states, 150 countries. But so far, the data up to December 2020 is concerned, we are having almost more than 40.5 million new internal displacements which have been recorded by international organizations functioning in the area of internal displacement. But there is a question And the question is the displacement breakdown. How to break down this internal displacement understanding by conflict and disaster type. Almost, if you take into account violence and conflict that has generated internal displacement and the amount of population which we find because of conflict and violence, that is almost 10 million internally displaced persons as of now. If you take into account by 2020 the total new displacements, that is 40.5 million, as I have already submitted. So if you put together, that constitute more than 50, I should say 50 million internally displacements, almost in 148 or 49 nation states. So the situation is very grim, situation is very diabolical, and it is heart-wrenching, and therefore it becomes necessary, my dear friends, how to address these kinds of problems of internal displacement. If you recall, recently, this year only, in this semester, I have also organized under the Faculty of Legal Studies seminar webinar series. We have invited, as a faculty collective, we have invited Miss Sumbul Rizvi. And the topic was how to address the problems of internal displacement. If I am correct in my submission, we were contemplating, we were visualizing an international binding treaty on internal displacement. So you can very well understand what has been the concerns, what has been the particularly so far the sovereignty narratives are concerned. So it is very difficult, my dear friends, to have an internally or IDP treaty, and that too at international level, because there were 55 million internally displaced people across the world at the end of 2020. And out of this, 48 million as a result of conflict and violence, and 7 million as a result of natural disasters. A record 48 million people were living in internal displacement as a consequence of conflict and violence in 59 countries and territories as of December 2020. So you can very well understand this internal fragmentation, this internal breakdown, how these kinds of displacement, and particularly the social and economic impacts of this kind of a displacement, constitute another important facet. More than 23 million people under the age of 18 were internally displaced people, globally speaking. And they are also confronted with significant impacts on their education. If you take into account the global cost of one of the displacements was 21 billion in 2020. If you take into account and the fragmentation of this particular figure, it also includes, my dear friends, the cost of providing people displaced by conflict and violence with support for their housing, education, health, and security, and other accounts for their loss of income. And that should not be forgotten. If you take into account the entire fragmentation or intra-fragmentation of internally displaced people by age group, you will find that from birth to up to 4 years, there are 7.2 million internally displaced people. In the age group of what you call 5 to 14, you will find there are as many as a 12 point or 13 what you call million people worldwide are internally displaced in this particular age group. There is another important age group, and that is 15 to 24 years of age group. You will find there are as many as 10.5 million internally displaced persons. And from 25 up to 65 or 64, you will find there are as many as 22 million internally displaced persons worldwide. And 65 plus people, if you take this particular age group, you will find there are as many as 2.6 million people internally displaced. So you can understand that every age group is having some kind of a what we call problems or confronting the issue of internal displacement. But so far the regional understanding is concerned, or the regional overviews are concerned, you can very well understand, my dear friends, that most new displacements are triggered by conflict and violence in by the end of 2020 were recorded in sub-Saharan Africa, Middle East and North Africa. The majority took place in the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Nigeria, and this trend is going on as per the past years trends of internal displacement in these particular regions. My dear friends, I'm sorry. Most new displacements which we have witnessed at the end or in the month of December 2020 were recorded in East Asia and the Pacific as well as in South Asia. And tropical cyclones, monsoon rains, and floods, droughts hit highly exposed areas that are home to millions of people. If you take into account one particular region like sub-Saharan Africa, you will find that in this particular region, internal displacement crisis is spread to previously relative unaffected areas of the sub-Saharan Africa in 2020. While long-standing upheavals in others are aggravated by the emergence of the new armed groups and increasing or accelerating violence. This particular region, that is the sub-Saharan Africa, also experienced unusually long and intense rainy seasons. The rains caused a flooding in areas already affected and confronted by violence, promoting new and secondary what we call human displacements. So this has been the situation. If you take into account in this particular region, my dear friends, I am talking of the sub-Saharan Africa, you will find 6.8 million internally displaced persons have exclusively been made by conflict. And if you take into account another important category of the natural disasters in this particular category of the sub-Saharan Africa, you will find as many as 4.3 million people were displaced internally because of natural disasters. So that is the situation. If you take into account another important region, that is the Middle East and North Africa, you will find due to conflict 2.1 million people have been displaced, whereas so far the natural disasters induced internal displacement is concerned, we find as many as 350,000 people have been displaced. The year 2020, my dear friends, in case of the Middle East and North Africa, marked the 10th what we call anniversary of the start of the Arab Spring. And in this particular year, in Libya, Syria, Yemen, where the uprising escalated into armed conflict, internal displacement continues to have devastating after effects. Around as many as 11.8 or 12 million people were living as internally displaced persons across the regions as a result of conflict and violence, and many what we call obstacles remain to their finding safety, rebuilding their lives, and achieving some kind of a durable solution. This has been the situation so far the Middle East and North Africa is concerned. If you take into account another important region so far internal displacement is concerned, you will find I'm talking of the East Asia and the Pacific. As many as 2 lakh people were displaced because of conflict alone in East Asia and Pacific, or a little bit less. Another one is that is so far natural disasters or the climate change is concerned, as many as almost 12 million people, 12 plus million people I should say, have been displaced because of the natural disasters. Most of the disasters displacement recorded globally in 2020, my dear friends, took place in the East Asia and the Pacific region. It has been caused because of the cyclones, seismological activities, hexicological imbalances, typhoons, floods, and other sort of what we call tectonic imbalances and volcanic eruptions. And these developments ultimately triggered as many as 12 million plus new displacements in 2020 alone, the highest figure since 2016. And other what you call and if you take into account the entirety of these figures, you will find this particular figure remains unprecedented in the recorded history of internal displacement. Powerful storms, powerful flooding fueled by climate violations and climate change variations, such as what you call La Nina hurricane has been there, and that has also triggered as many as 94% of what you call of entire natural disasters. So you can very well understand, my dear friends, what has been the situation. Now I take you to another important region, and that is the region which is very, very important to us because we also hail from this particular region, and that is South Asia. My dear friends, in South Asia, what we have been witnessing, this particular region has witnessed internal displacement that has been caused by conflict, and there are as many as more than 4 lakh people. And so far, natural disasters are concerned, there are as many as 9.2 million people who have been displaced because of what you call of climate change or the natural disasters. South Asia, my dear friends, accounted for almost 1/3 of the world's new disaster displacements in December 2020. Around 9.2, as I have told you, million were recorded, and above average figure for the second year in a new cyclone, Amphan triggered nearly 5 million evacuations from Bangladesh, India, Myanmar, and Bhutan in the month of May, making it the largest, disaster displacement event of the year globally. Monsoon rain and floods affected the whole region from the June onwards, and that was, very much, true in case of, Bangladesh. So you can very well understand that we, as the South Asians, are equally affected so far natural disasters and climate change, what you call, developments which are taking around the globe. They are also adversely impacting our human existence on this beautiful planet. There is another important, region, my dear friends, and that is Americas. In this particular region, my dear friends, what we have been, witnessing, and that is the disasters which have triggered the vast majority of the new displacements in Americas in the month of December or by the end of 2020, with 4.5 million recorded. The highest figure, this is the highest figure in the last 10 years. Devastating and destroying wildfires triggered mass displacement in the United States alone. Unprecedented, displacement took place in Guatemala, Honduras, and Nicaragua, which were badly affected by the most active Atlantic hurricane season on record. Conflict and violence, my dear friends, further, triggered around what you call, or almost more than, or around, 250,000, displacements, including in, El Salvador, Colombo, Mexico, Haiti, and other important, what you call, nation states around this particular, geopolitical, setting. So, but there is another important, region. You can also take certain important, figures so far internal displacement is concerned around the world, and that is the Europe and Central Asia. My dear friends, natural disasters triggered almost 234,000 new displacements in Europe and Central Asia in 2020. The second, what you call, highest figures on record for the region. However, the new displacement by conflict and violence were also recorded largely as a result of the fighting that broke between Armenia and Azerbaijan in Nagorno-Karabakh in September alone. And you can very well understand how many people have been, there internally displacement because of the conflict and violence which is going on between Ukraine and Russia right now. I'm not at all talking at these states and refugees which have been, generated because of this ongoing war. And they are going to be what you call more than 7 millions. And this is the, figure which I have been receiving from unconfirmed, sources. So far, the new class of refugees, a new category of Ukrainian refugees is concerned. So you can very well understand this has been the situation so far, the refugee exodus from Ukraine into neighborhood nation states like Moldova, Hungary, Greece, Belarus, Poland, and other important what you call nation states. They have been what you call giving some kind of a shelter. The people are entering into these territories. But so far internal displacement is concerned, they also constitute a very, very important category in Europe and Central Asia. So you can very well understand this is the situation. But we have to talk separately. So far, changing climate is concerned, or climate change is concerned. That has also generated a new class of, internally displaced persons. My dear friends, persistent misconceptions which have been encapsulating disaster displacement with serious implications and ramifications for people, as well as to policy responses or policy formulation. These misconceptions, my dear friends, include, for example, the disaster displacement is short-term, ephemeral, when in reality it often becomes complicated. The role that the climate change plays in driving disaster displacement is also often seen as a direct one. However, not all weather-related disasters, not all climate change-induced, human displacements and their associated what you call, displacement are directly related to climate change. There were, or there have been significant advances in the development of the national and regional policies on climate change displacement and climate-induced what you call, migration, and the global attention on the issue that has also been what you call, accelerating and increasing. A number of countries now recognizes climate change induced, human displacement as an issue of national and global priority. But there has always been a question of, implementation. Implementation and assessing progress in doing so are the next priorities of the international community or the community of the civilized nation states. filling the data, what we call, data gaps on displacement associated with disasters and climate change is essential if we are to understand how the phenomenon, how this entire, trend and patterns impacts and creates obstructions, progress, particularly on progress on achieving the sustainable development agenda that has to be what we call taken into consideration. Because in the light of the 17 UN global goals which are going to be implemented, which must, or their implementation must be achieved by the year 2030. So here lies another important dimension, my dear friends, and that dimension is relating to the ongoing global pandemic. What has been the impact of the COVID-19 global pandemic on internal displacement? This is another important feature, and this should not be forgotten. Because the COVID-19 pandemic heightened internally displaced persons' needs and generated new risks in 2020 alone, while creating significant operational and financial challenges for governments and the humanitarian agencies. That should not be forgotten. It has to be taken into consideration. But I am talking of a larger question at this stage, and the larger question that comes to my mind is, my dear friends, how to end internal what we call displacement. That has to be taken into consideration, and this is something which is very, very important. How to end? People are living in displacement, and it is axiomatic from the submissions which I have submitted for your consideration, for your perusal. If you take into account, my dear friends, in case of conflict disasters, millions and millions of people were living in internal displacement as a result of conflict and violence in more than what we call 65 nation states up to 2020 alone. And unfortunately, this figure is the highest ever recorded. So how to end? What kind of a measures should be undertaken to end internal displacement? Is there any kind of a possibility, any kind of a hope that really establishes some kind of a mechanism, strategy, policy, or policy formulation, or gives us some kind of a framework? By employing that particular framework, will it be possible to end this kind of a internal displacement? Because the national governments are responsible to end internal displacement, because only the guidance of an international character is available for the redressal of the grievances of the internally displaced persons, because they are also living in refugee-like situations in their homelands. My dear friends, the first yardstick, first important mechanism that comes to my mind is that there were visible efforts to prevent and respond to internal displacement in 2020, in 2021, and including, if you include 2022, you will also find that there have been some efforts to prevent and respond to internal displacement. We have been witnessing encouraging developments in a number of countries, underscored the key ingredients for success. The new national initiatives in some of the nation states showed greater levels of political commitment. Because without any kind of a political will, we cannot address internal displacement in our respective national jurisdictions. Consolidated capacity, my dear friends, across humanitarian and development what we call sectors are demonstrated in a better what we call coordination and augmented what we call investment. That is the hallmark. The improvements in the quality and the Equality of what you call of the data available also enabled better reporting and analysis, which is in turn informs more than effective what you call responses and risk what you call mitigation. And these measures must be taken into consideration for further what you call understanding. And this has further generated a commitment how to end internal displacement. If you take into account these measures to end or to prevent internal displacement, you will find that the next decade has the potential to become an important chapter in global efforts to reduce protracted internal displacement. For the global what you call pragmatism to took place, a global partnership is needs to be systematically collect, evaluate, and share practices and experience and facilitate peer-to-peer lessons and support to end internal displacement. The exchange and cooperation among states that are dealing with internal displacement will be essential. More support for internal displacement, my dear friends, is needed as they can become catalysts to create incentives for countries to act. This is something which must also be taken into consideration while talking of internal displacement. Therefore, my dear friends, if you take these submissions, what is important to understand that we must undertake, we have to study certain important international treaty obligations which we find in 1991 United Nations Convention on Refugees with its additional protocol of 1967. We also require, my dear friends, a 1954 UN Convention on Statelessness. We also require, my dear friends, a 1961 UN Convention on the Reduction of Statelessness. Again, there is a requirement to study 1967 UN Declaration on Territorial Asylum. Then we need 1969, another important regional guarantee in the form of 1969 OAU Convention governing the specific aspects of refugee problems in Africa. And my suggestion would be, my dear friends, to study the preamble of 1969 OAU Convention, and particularly articles which start from Article 1st and goes up to Article 15. These 15 articles constitute a very, very important guarantee, understanding, as well as the contemplation to address internal displacement at regional level. Another important instrument which I should suggest, and that is 1984 Cartagena Declaration, which is applicable in situations of the Latin American nation states. Then 1984 UN Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhuman and Degrading Treatment or Punishment, and that is popularly known as the Torture Convention, that should also be taken into consideration. Then 1998 Guiding Principle on Internal Displacement. These are the UN guiding fundamental principles on internal displacement that should also be taken into consideration. Then only we would be in a better position to appreciate the criticality as well as the implications of internal displacement, because this is the only international declaratory framework which is available on internal displacement, where we find a mention as many as in two important articles where we find that internal displacement has been addressed. Then we should not forget, my dear friends, another important facet, that is 1998 UNSCR Guiding Principles on Internal Displacement. Then we cannot and we should not, my dear friends, and I am emphasizing 2000 London Declaration of International Law Principles on Internally Displaced Persons. This London Declaration constitutes a very, very important segment of our understanding. Then in 2001, Bangkok Principles of the Asian African Legal Consultative Committee, which is known as the Afro-Asian what you call consultative committee. They have also or you may call it the ALCO, they have also came out with certain fundamental principles, which are popularly known as the Bangkok Principles on Internal Displacement. Then 2006, International Conference on the Great Lakes Region Protocol on the Protection and Assistance to Internally Displaced Persons. That is another important, development that should not escape our what we call, intellectual vision as well as understanding. And another important one is the 2007 UN Basic Principles and Guidelines on Development-Based Evictions and Displacement. Then the 2008 Guiding Principle of Internal Displacement. Certain important annotations have also been, taken into considerations, and these annotations were, appreciated by another important, international refugee law authority, and that is Professor Kalin. And I would also be, sharing his what he call, understandings on these, issues. Then there is another important, my dear friends, convention, that is the 2009 African Union Convention on the Protection and Assistance or to internally displaced persons, which is popularly known as the Kampala Convention, and that is a very, very important segment that really gives us an understanding, and that ultimately provides the groundwork. If tomorrow we are going to have some kind of a international treaty on internal displacement, then definitely 2009 Kampala Convention that has been adopted by African Union nation states may constitute maybe the basis, maybe the what we call roadmap, how to enhance international, or how to contemplate and how to make or come out with an international treaty, a binding treaty on internally displaced persons. Then there is another important framework for durable solutions for internally displaced persons that was adopted in 2010. And in 2012, my dear friends, there is a United Nations rather General Assembly resolution, and that takes into account the human rights of internally displaced persons. Then in 2013, my dear friends, there is another important what we call understanding that takes into account the responsibility and action on internal what we call displacement. Then 2013, in the same year, UN General Assembly resolution is also there, which takes into account, my dear friends, the protection of and assistance to internally displaced persons. Then in 2014, UNHCR and IPU, International Parliamentary Union on Nationality and Statelessness, they also came out with a handbook for parliamentarians in Geneva in the year 2014. That also takes into account what kind of a legislative measures should be there, how the national parliaments at the global level, how the parliaments or the highest legislative establishments in all the geopolitical entities must do to end internal displacement in their respective territories. Then we should not we should not forget that in the year 1995, even the Amnesty International has also came out with some kind of a roadmap, which is popularly known as the Playing Human Pinball. That has been the title of this particular report of the Amnesty International. They also came out with an idea how to address internal displacement at a global level, and that must also be taken into consideration while appreciating the various aspects of the internally displaced people. Then there is another important dimension. We should not forget that after Amnesty International, the Council of Europe has also issued on many occasions certain important European Council directives, which are popularly known as. Then the European instruments constitute another important segment, and that should also be the basis of our understanding how to end internal displacement. Then the global protection, what we call cluster, has also been, which is popularly known as the GPC, the Global Protection Cluster, that is famously known as the Handbook for the Protection of Internally Displaced persons. Then we should not forget, my dear friends, UN Office for the Coordination of the Humanitarian Affairs, US Committee for what we call refugees, that came into existence under one of the finest legislation passed by the US Congress, that is the Refugee Act of 1980. I have already submitted my observations on that very particular piece of legislation in my earlier submissions. Then UNHCR Handbook for the Protection of Internally Displaced Person, and again the UNHCR, the State of the World Refugees, and that is the annual feature of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, what we call publications, that takes into account what has been the entire what we call canvas of internal displacement. This, after narrating and submitting these various instruments, another important dimension that comes to my mind is, and that is certain important questions. How to address these questions on internal displacement. The very first and the basic and the most fundamental question that comes to my mind is, what is the concept of the internally displaced persons? And how should we address this particular situation of internally displaced persons? That is another important dimension that should also be taken into consideration. So my understanding that I'm going to share with all of you in the subsequent what you call minutes, we have to take into account, my dear friends, how the concept of internally displaced persons has emerged in the past what you call more than what you call 22 years of the, because it has been adopted in 1998 so far. The normative substantive understanding of internal displacement at global level is concerned, and how this has been framed by the law and policy. Because application of law and application of policy are the two distinct pillars in addressing the end of or stoppage of internal displacement. How are, another important question that comes to my mind is, how are internally displaced persons different from refugees, and how are they not? What are the consequences of classifying an individual and IDP instead of a refugee? What rights, what guidelines, what norms exist for internally displaced people? What are the rules relating to the forcible displacement, transfer and deportation in international humanitarian law and human rights law, international criminal law, and the particularly the criminalization of the forced what you call displacement and forced migration, on which I have already submitted an article in the public domain. That is there, I think that was published in 2017 on this particular aspect. So how to address and attend on internally displaced persons in conflict what you call context, before moving on to consider other forms of internal displacement. How powerful is international law in the field of the refugee protection? That must also be taken into consideration while addressing internally displaced people's what we call problems. Why IDPs are especially vulnerable, that should also be taken into account. And should we advocate, my dear friends, for a binding UN treaty on internal displacement? That is the most important question. And I have also framed a topic of the recent what we call talk on the basis of this particular question. And we have to at the same time, my dear friends, try to identify the main strengths and weaknesses of the current international regime in ensuring the implementation which is available for addressing the problems of internally displaced persons. But at the same time, we should not forget how to appreciate and impart a solid critical understanding of a number of topics, including their reception under international humanitarian law, the domestic law and policy on IDPs, and how to extend transitional justice to internal displacement and persons displaced by disasters and climate change, and what is the context within which the protection of refugees and other displaced what we call persons take place. What are the legal and empirical understandings of the roles of the key protection actors that might be what we call developed through the core models, in order to consider how these may be or best be influenced and build on their skills in the relevant areas. What are the models on developing a firm appreciation of factors that influence how protection actors such as the states and UNHCR believe, and the practical strategies through which such behavior may be influenced. How to bring out, my dear friends, another important question, bring out the critical understanding of the key theories of the norms, adherence and normative change in the field of human rights and refugee protection, critical insights in the lobbying, media, campaigning, monitoring work in the refugee field, and difficult strategies for managing project what we call cycle, drafting legal what we call, as well as policy interventions, I should say, and how to carry them out in the longer what we call run. So far their implementation is concerned, but at the same time the financial implication should not be forgotten, and how to raise, how to indulge into fundraising for the implementation of these measures to end and to address these kinds of questions on internal displacement. What is the international law relating to statelessness and stateless person, and its development over the past more than what we call 60 years, that should also be taken into consideration. But at the same time, my dear friends, what is important is what are the critical understanding of the concept and implications of the nationality in international law, the empirical roots, and the scope of the problem of statelessness across the world, definition of a stateless person, and to what extent this definition is going to be relevant, that has been contained in 1954 United Nations Convention on Statelessness or Status of Stateless Persons, and its conceptual connections with the refugee concept, the push what we call towards elimination of statelessness, that has been framework with another important framework, which is known as how to reduce statelessness, in the form of a convention that was adopted in the year 1961 under the auspices of the United Nations organizations. So there are a number of what we call of questions. There are other important factors to environmental what we call aspects interact with which, what exactly has been the result of natural disasters and other form of what we call of disasters caused by the climate change. So we have to take into account. This also reminds me to apprise you about certain important cases as well, which we are going to address. The cases like Tahir Hussain Khan versus Canada, that is a very, very important and leading decision delivered in 1994 by the committee against what we call torture under the auspices of the United Nations organization. Then we should not forget another important decision, another important case is also there, that is the Chehel versus United Kingdom of the European Court of Human Rights. Then I have also deliberated in my previous submissions in the last week another important decision of 1996 that was also delivered by the European Court of Human Rights, that is famously known as the Lois Doy versus Turkey. Then we are also having another important what we call decisions, and that is Hamidov versus Russia, that was delivered by the European Court of Human Rights in 2007. That should also be taken into consideration. And another important decision that is also what we call there, that is the Shaginets and others versus Georgia of the 2010. This decision has also been delivered by the European Court of Human Rights. We are going to understand what has been the implications of these decisions delivered by the European Court of Human Rights, particularly on internal displacement. Then here lies some of the very, very specific questions which we intend to what we call collectively address during these this particular deliberation, and that is, who are IDPs? Where do they come from? Are they different from refugees and stateless persons? What are the causes of their displacement? What are the critical issues in their protection? How to appreciate their refinement? What are the existing legal framework for their protection? And what are the alternative protection or alternative solutions for addressing their grievances? Very basic questions. If we are able to address these basic questions, then everything would be hunky-dory in standing the entire what we call facet of internal displacement. So what is your take on these questions? What is your understanding of internal displacement? Anybody? Yes, Amin sir.
Sir, actually, when we talk about climate refugees or internal displacement,
Yes.
so in that context, I was thinking like that. Is it fair to be categorized as a climate refugee? climate doesn't change by itself, right?
Right.
So climate change is happening through our various and action, like development in infrastructure, economic growth, like that, uh, uh, which already you mentioned. So it's mainly responsible for the first world countries. So if, for example, if Maldives summers today, is Maldives responsible for that? No. So why we are categorizing about climate refugee, not development refugee or like that? Because climate is not the responsible for creating refugee, right?
Right. My dear friend, I immensely appreciate your intervention, Mr. Amin. Governments are responsible for creating internally displaced populations. Let me clarify. But my submissions, my dear friends, will never be taken as a final word. What is important is when we are talking of or any kind of a submission that comes from my side, that also demands some alternative observations, and the student community is requested, all of you are requested to respond and come out with certain important alternatives. When we are talking of internally displaced populations, then this is my well considered, well formulated understanding that the national governments are responsible to a very great extent. You are right, and all of us are correct in our own understandings that we can create various nomenclatures in the name of categorizations, as you have pointed out. We can categorize that these are not climate change refugees, these are development refugees or development induced refugees or development induced IDPs. We can also address them at climatically displaced persons, CDPs. That is an expression which we have used in our book on climate refugees in South Asia. For the first time, we came out with this kind of a nomenclature in our book. But we cannot absolve from the state responsibility of many of the geopolitical entities. It is the state responsibility to protect even these kind of situations, and for which international law is available on responsibility to protect. Because it has become the part of the governance, a part of the bad governance, I should say, across the world. Nation states, whenever they are undertaking any kind of a development activity, they do not provide any kind of a rehabilitation alternative program or alternative rehabilitation program, particularly for those people who are likely to be displaced because of development projects. I can share, and this is rampant in each and every geopolitical entity so far the global south jurisdictions are concerned. You can take the example from South Asia alone, my dear friends. Whenever the development activities are undertaken by the national governments, they do not provide any kind of a alternative. Suppose that tomorrow the government of India is undertaking, and even in the past, the government of India has undertaken various what we call projects, dam projects, construction of big dams. But the government of India did not provide any kind of a solutions so far the displaced populations are concerned. I can give you an example of the Conjectrix, what we call dam project in South India. In the central India, we have been witnessing, and still what we call these people are clamoring for their rights. I'm talking of Sardar Sarovar project that has what we call notoriously attracted international limelight. Another important dimension which I must share with you, The construction of big dams has become a fashion in South Asia because of what you call of the development needs, because of energy needs, because it has to what you call generate a lot of what you call electricity. So if you take into account these projects, in the name of developments, a lot of people are going to be displaced or have been displaced, have been uprooted from their habitual residences. So in such kind of a situation, you can very well understand, my dear friends, that a caveat in each and every kind of reports notes that the displacement is a complex, fluid, and politically sensitive phenomenon. More difficult, my dear friends, to measure the numbers of refugees, and the stock of data used for some countries is relatively old and possibly decaying. My dear friends, internally displaced persons, Mr. Amin, have been forced from their homes. I mean, internally displaced persons, they are generally forced from their homes for many of the same reasons as the refugees, but have not crossed an international border. That is the only missing link. And because of this missing link, they are not in a position to attract international what we call protection. Internally displaced persons, my dear friends, often persecuted or under attack by their own governments. They are frequently in a more desperate situation than refugees. You can very well understand the problems, what kind of problems these displaced people, internally displaced persons, have been confronting in their own nation states. However, internally displaced persons also encounter, and they also outnumber refugees 2 or 1, as no international agency has a formal mandate to aid them. That is the most callous what we call point. Internally displaced persons further are increasingly at the forefront of the humanitarian agenda, but a very little is done so far their protection is concerned, so far their safety is concerned. Internally displaced persons, my dear friends, are sometimes called internal refugees, but are more what we call often known as internally displaced persons. Since the end of the Cold War, the number of people uprooted by conflict, ethnic strife, and human rights violations has soared, and the major chunk which we find, my dear friend, is of internally displaced persons. So that is the understanding. That is the situation of internal displacement. But whatever may be the categorizations, we may have different kind of a nomenclature. Was I able to address your question, or I have left some of the points you can raise again,
Yes.
my dear?
Yes, sir. But like when you mention about the limitation, but limitation that they can't cross the international border. But what about what would be the island situation, like the island countries? Now, they are in a high risk to be a refugee, like climate, whatever. So maybe there is some also limitation. Now they have to be migrated because they are in island. They are in highly risk in that position.
Yes. There are, countries like Iceland. They have also attracted the attention of the international community. And in the vicinity of South Asia, or as a part of South Asia, we are also having an island nation, a very vulnerable island nation, that is Maldives, where even one of the former president of Maldives has also conducted his cabinet meeting beneath the waters. I'm talking the President Nasheed, who recently conducted his cabinet meeting, and the purpose was to attract international attention because of the potential capsizing of this particular island nation state. And they have approached the government of India in case of any kind of a drowning, of submerging of this particular island nation called Maldives. Will it be possible to transfer the population of the Maldivians from Maldives to India. That is the nearest what you call country. Another important nation state that was also approached by the government of Maldives is Australia. Whether the Australia in the coming days or in the coming years would be in a position to offer this particular option, the transfer of population of the Maldivian people, or the Maldivian population transfer from Maldives to Australia, or in some parts of the Australia, and they are at the same time very much what we call ready to buy a piece of land either in India or in Australia. So climate change has also presented a very, very diabolical problems for the human existence. Existential survival has become the key what we call concern of many of the island nation states. Because in the name of development, in the name of deforestation, and because of ecological imbalances, because of developmental activities, because of deforestation, again in the name of development, many of the developed country, or rather I should say the global north jurisdictions, have been preaching global south jurisdictions that they should not what we call put their entire what we call programs of the development trajectory. They should not go for any kind of industrialization. If you take into account the mandate of the two important international frameworks, one is the declaratory and another one is the mandatory. The declaratory framework that was concluded in the year 1971 or 72, which is popularly known as the Stockholm Declaration on Environment, and the second one that took place when the senior George Bush was there as the president of the United States of America. An international conference was convened under the auspices of the United Nations Organization in 1992, which is today known as the Rio Conference. Rio de Janeiro in the Latin American countries, in one of the capitals, this particular conference was conducted. If you take into account the framework convention that was adopted in 1992 under the auspices of the United Nations organizations, that is today known as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCs. So you will understand these two important frameworks, Stockholm framework and Rio framework, as I generally call them, they have provided a vision, a contemplation, what should be done in case of what we call of climate change, number one. And subsequently, if you take into account the various conference of parties which are popularly known as the COPs, and the latest one recently took place in Glasgow in Scotland. What has been the mandate of this particular conference? We also conducted a conference, a workshop as a part of the and we collaborated with some of the important international organizations recently, and the invites were also sent to all of you. So we have to understand, my dear friends, to what extent, whatever the goalpost, whatever the targets, whatever the objectives were set, to what extent the international community has been what you call successful in achieving those very objectives. But at the same time, we should not forget the unilateral actions which were undertaken by the Donald Trump administration. Whether it is the Kyoto Protocol of 1997, whether it is the Paris Conference of 2015, and whatever the agenda was agreed, Trump administration immediately withdrew itself from its international obligations. So far, the reduction of the ozone layer is concerned. So far, the reduction of the gaseous emissions were concerned. So far, even further, whatever the hazardous what we call effluents were emanating from the from various industries manned by United States of America, everything was put into dustbin, and they have simply absolved from all their international obligations. And ultimately, the Trump administration shared its responsibility, and they were not in a, they categorically declared that these international commitments are not in the interest of what you call of the development of the United States of America, and in the name of America First policy, that was the most what you call talked about slogan that was flirted by the Trump administration, and under the garb of this particular slogan, they withdrew from their responsibilities unilaterally without any kind of a consultation. So what kind of a behavior was expressed by the Trump administration so far international law obligations were concerned. So this has been the situation, because it is mandatory, my dear friends, whenever we are going to withdraw from our international obligations, number one, we should suggest some kind of a alternative. When we are not in a position to achieve our targets, whatever the targets have been agreed at international level on the basis of unanimity, on the basis of consensus, on the basis of international uniformity, then we must try to offer alternative mechanisms, and alternatives or options must also be provided. But in case of climate change, this has not been provided. In case of what we call of the development projects, it has not been provided. Development is taking place, but collateral what you call damage, the ancillary what you call damage, ancillary implications are not being appreciated, and that is why today we are talking of internally displaced persons. So here lies another important question: what is the concept of internally displaced persons? Anything else, Mr. Amin?
No, sir. Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. So when we are talking of the concept of internally displaced persons, it must be understood, my dear friends, that the internally displaced persons have departed from their homes. Unlike refugees, they have not left the country whose citizens they are normally. IDPs can invoke all human rights and international humanitarian law guarantees available to the citizens of that very country. Applicability of the refugee law to IDPs is not at all possible. Therefore, internally displaced persons come and presented as a special category. Why a special category? Because shared characteristics and particular vulnerabilities we attribute to internally displaced population. There is a need at the same time, my dear friends, there is a need to delineate the circumstances. Beneficiaries must be identified in order for their needs to be met. This has to be done in case of internally displaced person. But here lies what could be the definition. What should be the definition of internally displaced persons as a concept? How should we go about? What kind of a measures should be undertaken to define internally displaced person? Or is there any kind of a possibility to have the definition of internally displaced persons? That should also be taken into consideration. My dear friends, when there is a question of defining internally displaced persons, we may try to define them like groups or persons of or the group of persons who have been forced to or obliged to flee or to leave their homes or places of habitual residence, in particular as a result of, I should say, or in order to avoid the effects of the armed conflict, situations of generalized violence, effects of what we call armed conflict, violations of human rights or natural or human made disasters, and who have not crossed an internationally recognized border. This class of people who find themselves stranded within their own homelands should be addressed as internally displaced persons. That is the most general what we call understanding. But this is a group of people who are extremely vulnerable. How? We must categorically appreciate the vulnerability of internally displaced persons. IDPs may be in transit from one place to another within the country and maybe what you call in hiding and may be forced towards, unhealthy or inhospitable, environments within a geopolitical entity. And that must also be taken into consideration as a concept of, vulnerability of internally displaced persons. IDPs are social, what you call organizations are destroyed or damaged. That is another important. And you have to, this is what I would like to, request at this stage, whatever the points I am, narrating before you, whatever the points I am, placing for your consideration, you should, collectively try to identify these, points and compare them, these points with that of the, problems of, refugees. Show the social organization, the social systematization, is generally and the social what we call rubrics that is dismantled, destroyed and devastated or damaged. IDPs may experience a profound psychosocial distress. This should not be forgotten, because they are basically losing their right to belongingness. It is a historical reference, my dear friends. It's a historical root that must be preserved under all circumstances, because that creates a bonding and belonging. These are the two important facets of a single right, and that is having some historical value that gets destroyed in entire what we call process. IDPs, my dear friends, at the same time experience and they experience all kinds of anxieties, and they are also removed from sources of income and livelihood. IDPs, schooling generally gets disrupted, that is interrupted, and IDPs may be displaced to areas where local inhabitants are of a different groups or inhospitable, and this has become the hallmark, because in media language, in vernacular press, you will find they are not in a position, suppose during the communal rights, during communalism, during development projects, during armed conflict, during generalized violence, during massive violations of human rights in a particular locality, the people generally uprooted and they move from that particular place to another place within the country or within the locality. In such kind of situations, my dear friends, the reception population, the destination population, they generally do not accept them. There is no possibility even within the country with the population with the same what we call nationality and nationality documents, they become inhospitable. They are not assimilated. There are a lot of difficulties for their integration with that of the local population or the population of the reception area or the or destination what we call areas. Therefore, IDPs, what we call, loyalty might be questioned by armed, what we call combatants. IDPs may lack identity documents in certain important, situations. And at the same time, my dear friends, IDPs also run a higher risk than those remaining at home. Why? Because to have their children forcibly re-recruited, to become victims of the gender-based violence, to become what you call separated from the family members, to be excluded from education, to be without a job, and to be excluded from political participation. That is the situation. This is something we have also been witnessing in case of what you call the South Asian jurisdictions during development projects, during communalism, during rights, all kinds of rights. It may be the racial rights, linguistic rights, religious rights. In all these situations, we come across with these kinds of problems of internally displaced people. Problems, my dear friends, usually not faced by those who remain in their homes, and that is why we are talking of, and we must talk of special needs of certain internally displaced persons. What we have been what you call witnessing, I mean, in the name of problems, generally not confronted by those who stay in their homes, like lack of shelter and problems related to camps. We find refugees in camps, and refugee camps are there. But in case of internally displaced persons, we do not find such kind of situation. Loss of property and access to livelihoods, discrimination because of being displaced, lack of identity cards, lack of access to services, lack of political rights, restitution or the compensation for lost property, and the problems of return and integration. These are some of the important what we call problems which are generally not faced by those who remain in their what we call homes. Then we also come across with certain important protection gaps. There are protection gaps when we are talking of internally displaced people. For example, primary responsibility rests with the state. That is the most acceptable statement. That is the most legally valid what you call statement. State may be unable or unwilling to provide a protection, and that is the protection gap. And what is the protection gap? International community steps in. In case of internally displaced persons, there are what you call powerful nations. There are what you call politically sensitive groups in various geopolitical entities who may come out subsequently. Yes, there is a protection gap, and that protection gap is generally pointed out. Protection, my dear friends, as I have already submitted, if you recall, what is protection? Protection is defined, my dear friends, as all activities aimed at obtaining full respect for the rights of individual in accordance with the letter and spirit of the relevant bodies of law, namely human rights law, international humanitarian law, international refugee law, international constitutional law, or the idea of the transformative constitutionalism or constitutionalism per se. Protection can be seen, my dear friends, therefore, as having three different what we call dimensions. That comes to my mind is that the protection as an objective, protection as a legal responsibility, protection as an activity. Consideration displaced what we call or generally what we call emanates from the guiding principle of internal displacement. Because what we find is there is a creation of the mandate of the representatives of the UN Secretary General on internal displacement. And when we are talking of the protection principles, the areas of activities must also encompass. So far the protection principles are concerned, these protection principles must promote respect for the human rights of the internally displaced population. It must initiate as a protection principle the dialogue with governments and non-governmental organizations and other important stakeholders. Protection principles, my dear friends, strengthen the international response to internally displaced people. At the same time, the protection principles also encapsulate the mainstreaming the human rights of internally displaced persons within the United Nations, what we call system. And at the same time, my dear friends, we should not forget, despite its being a declaratory, despite the fact that the 1998 UN guiding principle on internal displacements simply provides some kind of guidance. But in case of what we call of human rights, in case of what we call of fundamental civil liberties of an international character, we should not forget that today an individual is regarded as a subject of international law. That is why his existence, a dignified existence, a existence that provides him to eke out a dignified living within the what we call broadly of international human rights law, that must not be forgotten by the national governments, because the internally displaced persons also require an element of what we call of the complementarity, and that complementarity comes from what we call in aid and advice to the constitutional guarantees within the domestic jurisdiction of the geopolitical entity, that comes from the 9 core international human rights treaty obligations, and that constitute the basic and the most what we call fundamental principles, which is known as the protection principles of internally displaced persons. As I have, said, my dear friends, the primary responsibility for protecting internally displaced persons and all persons within their own country rests with the national authorities of a geopolitical entity. National responsibility is a core concept, my dear friends, of any response to internal displacement. It is a fundamental operating principle of the international community and is routinely emphasized by governments themselves as a function of their sovereignty. So they cannot, talk of that the sovereignty is violated when any kind of a, international response is, highlighted. Any kind of an internal. I mean, this should not be taken as an internal interference on the part of the, national government whenever it is pointed out by the community of nation states, and it is sometimes the very governments are responsible for protecting and assisting their internally displaced populations that are unable or even unwilling to do so, and might even be directly involved in forcibly uprooting what we call of civilians. In addition to ensuring, my dear friends, the protection of rights in accordance with the international law, national responsibility in situations of internal displacements entails preventing displacement and minimizing its adverse impacts, raising national what we call awareness of the problem, collecting data on the number of conditions of internally displaced persons, and supporting training on the rights of internally displaced persons, and creating a legal framework upholding the rights of the internally displaced person, and developing a national policy on internal displacement, and designating a national what we call focal authority or focal point on internally displaced persons. At the same time, it has to encourage a national human rights, or rather the national human rights institutions, to address internal displacement, and while ensuring that the IDPs participate in decision making and supporting durable what we call solutions. But at the same time, it has to allocate adequate resources to address internal displacement and cooperating with the international community when national capacity remains or becomes what we call insufficient, inadequate in addressing the problems of internally displaced people or persons. There are certain important developments as well. Developments, particularly I'm talking of the legal framework. The legal framework which has been designated for the protection of internally displaced persons. We should not forget, my dear friends, as time and again I have been pointing out, 1998 UN Guiding Principle on Internal Displacement, and particularly 2005 World Summit, where under recognition as important international framework for the protection of internally displaced persons was recognized and adopted, and 2019 African Union Convention on Protection and Assistance to Internally Displaced Persons, which is famously known as Kampala Convention, that should not be taken into consideration. But if you take into account, my dear friends, the contents of 1998 UNHCR Guiding Principle on Internal Displacement, you will find, or the UN what we call Guiding Principle issued in 1998, you will find section first that takes into account 4 important articles. And these articles generally undertakes certain important general principles which I have deliberated before you. There is another important section second, where you will find that there are certain important articles that it starts from Article 5 and goes up to Article 9, where you will find, my dear friends, the protection from displacement. So under section 3rd, you will also find the protection during displacement. And earlier section 2nd was taken, that was designated as protection from displacement, and section 3rd has been designated protection during displacement. And protection during displacement to constitute a very, very vital point, vital what we call segment of understanding what kind of protection should be extended during the transition or in transition. And that has been provided in articles that it starts from Article 10 and goes up to Article 23. Then there is also another important section, and that is section 4th, Under Section 4th, humanitarian assistance has been undertaken. That starts from Section 24 and that goes up to Section 27. Then we also come across, there is another important section, and that is Section 5. Under Section 5, we try to define, my dear friends, post-displacement phase, that it starts from Article 28 and goes up to Article 30. So these are the various, I mean, the content part, this is how you should try to understand this, 1998 UN guiding principles on internal displacement. But there are, general principles as well. When we are, talking of, general principles, let me remind you, my dear friends, IDP definition has also been provided: principle of equality before the law, then the principle of non-discrimination, and the primary responsibility of the national authorities. These are the four important fundamental principles. Let me repeat it: the definition part, equality before law principle, and the principle of non-discrimination, and the responsibility, the primary responsibility, the normative responsibility, the substantive responsibility of the national authorities, that must also be taken into consideration. Then what are the important points? We should not forget. And these important points must be on your fingertips. The point number one, my dear friends, that all human beings are entitled to fundamental rights and freedoms, including internally displaced people, internally displaced persons. Point number two, my dear friends, the guiding principles authoritatively, consolidate into one document relevant rights, norms, and obligations, including what we call the obligations taken from 9 core international human rights treaties. Because these, obligations must be understood, my dear friends, as MDGs and SDGs. Because MDGs and SDGs are not new. You should not mistakenly take them. These, MDGs, which ended in 2015 after completing 15 years of their existence, it remains debatable whether these, MDGs were achieved or not. But at the same time, my dear friends, so far as SDGs are concerned, they have to complete their cycle of implementation by the year 2030. Again, these, SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, under the auspices of the United Nations organizations, were also, taken from the 9 core international human rights treaties. Same kind of a yardstick should be, undertaken as important points. Important points when we are, talking of the development of the rights of the internally displaced persons under international law. Therefore, important points becomes some kind of a, objective, some kind of a guiding principle. The guiding principles are derived from binding existing law of an international character. Many nations, my dear friends, therefore have signed treaties or are subject to what we call human rights treaties or international humanitarian law treaties, which make the guiding principles binding upon their actions in their own countries if they are dealing with the situations of internal displacement. Guiding principles further, my dear friends, seeks clarifications on unclear areas and fields of implementation and fills gaps regarding the particular needs of the internally displaced what we call people. Therefore, out of this deliberation, my dear friends, 4 groups of relevant rights generally comes to my mind or come to my mind. Number 1 is rights related to physical security and integrity. I can give you and I can also share examples like for example, right to life and to be free of torture, assault, rape, and indignity, I should say. So that is a number 1 what we call group which takes into account certain important rights related to physical security and integrity and dignity. Another important one is the basic rights related to basic necessities of life. For example, the right to food, right to potable water, right to basic health, right to shelter, right to housing, cumulatively speaking. Another important, the third important group with relevant rights that comes to my mind is rights related to other economic, social, and cultural what you call protections or protection need. For example, the right to work, right to receive restitution, or right to receive compensation for lost property, and right to education. The third, I mean, the fourth important, category or four important, group of relevant rights of internally displaced persons constitute right related to what you call other civil and political, what you call, protection needs. For example, rights relating to the personal documentation, political participation, right to access to what you call, courts, or you may call it the judicial remedies, or right to constitutional remedies, which are available under all the, constitutions, even to foreigners, aliens, stateless, and freedom of what you call of, movement. These are some of the important what you call, rights which are available to the, internally displaced persons, wherefrom no exemption, no derogation, no deviation, no derogation is a possibility, and that cannot be permitted under any of the rights in the name of what we call the national emergency, because these are the non-derogable rights, these are the substantive rights, so that should be taken into consideration. Let me give you an example of certain important principles. When we are talking of 1998 United Nations Guiding Principle on Internal Displacement, so we should not forget that there are certain important principles as well. Like every human being has the right to liberty and security of person. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest or detention. This is a very, very important principle. But I am sharing this particular principle, that these principles have also been made available as a special category to internally displaced population in each and every geopolitical entity. How? Let me what you call let me share the source of this particular principle. This particular principle, that every human being has the right to liberty and security of person. No one shall be subject to any kind of arbitrary arrest or detention. This is a fundamental principle which is available under Articles 3 and 9 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is the fundamental principle which is also available, my dear friends, under Article 9 subclause 1 of the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, which is known as the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of 1966. And it is equally applicable to internally displaced persons, because every human being has the right to liberty and security of person. No one shall be subjected to arbitrary arrest or detention. And to give effect to this right for IDPs, my dear friends, they shall not be interned or confined to a camp. If in exceptional circumstances such internment or confinement is absolutely necessary, it shall not last longer than required by the circumstances, or it will not go beyond the constitutional what we call framework which has been available, like Article 21, like Article 31 of Bangladesh Constitution, like Article 7 of the Bhutan Constitution, like Article 7 of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan's constitution, that does not remain as Islamic republic. It has recently been declared as the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, but so far as 2004 constitution is concerned, that is there for our ready reference. So these are the the constitutional guarantees contemplated under all the national constitutions, but at the same time, IDPs shall be protected from discriminatory arrest and detention as a result of what we call their displacement, and in no case shall IDPs be taken hostage. That is another important guarantee that has been available under international law on human rights. So these are some of the fundamental principles, my dear friend, and that is why this fundamental principle must also be taken into consideration. I can also share a number of what we call principles, like suppose every human being has the right to respect for his or her what we call family life. So this is the principle, my dear friends, has been what we call, undertaken from the general principles derived from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Particularly, Article 16 becomes very, very relevant so far this particular, right is concerned. Then we should not forget another important, article that has also been taken from what we call, Fourth Geneva Conventions, Article 27, and the UN Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, particularly Article 23, where this principle becomes very, very important. And this principle has also been undertaken, has become the part of 1998 UN Guiding Principle on Internal Displacement. If you take into account the Principle 17, subclause 1 of 1998, guiding principles on internal displacement, then these articles becomes very, very important. And how to implement this particular, right for internally displaced persons? Family members who wish to remain together shall be allowed to do so. Families, my dear friends, which are separated by the displacement should be reunited as quickly as possible. All appropriate steps shall be undertaken or taken to expedite or to expedite or to accelerate the reunion of such families, particularly when children are involved. Special care, the paramount interest of the children, the welfare of a particular child should be the supreme priority of any geopolitical entity or any what we call authority entrusted with the responsibility of looking after these kinds of separated children or accompanied what we call child. Members of the internally displaced families whose personal liberty has been restricted by internment or confinement in camps shall have the right to remain together, and they should not be what we call separated in the name of the national security, in the name of what we call of terrorism, in the name of prosecution. The highest amount of what we call of dignity should be what we call made available to them. If you take into account the principle 28, that is also very, very important, my dear friends, when we are talking of the 1998 UN guiding principle on internal displacement. It is equally important because under principle 28, my dear friends, competent authorities have the primary duty and responsibility to establish conditions as well as provide the means, mechanisms, manners which allow internally displaced persons to return voluntarily in safety and with dignity. Dignity has always been what we call the hallmark of these kinds of situations, to their homes or places of habitual residence, or to resettle voluntarily another part of the country. And such authorities, my dear friends, shall endeavor to facilitate the reintegration of the returned or resettled IDPs. Special efforts must also be undertaken, my dear friends, to ensure the full participation of the IDPs in the planning and management of their return or resettlement and reintegration. For example, I can give you certain important examples. Every human being shall have the right to be protected against being arbitrarily displaced from his or her home or place of habitual residence, and that is why the core human rights, what we call norms, are involved. The core humanitarian principles which have been what we call embedded in this kind of a what we call understanding, that is that there should be a policy based on do no harm. That is the core humanitarian principle number one. Humanitarian imperative must be the basis of guiding all kinds of understandings for their resettlement, for their reintegration, for their re-assimilation. Then the another important what we call humanitarian principle would be the neutrality, and the fourth one would be the impartiality, and there has to be a provision of protection. These are some of the finest what we call core principles that should be undertaken when we are understanding this whole idea, the entire what we call narrative, how to protect internally displaced persons, what exactly their rights. So thank you very much for the day, my dear friends. And tomorrow I will start my deliberations with the status of what we call of the guiding principles. What kind of a reception has been there of the guiding principles within the what we call four walls of international law. If you have any questions, you are most welcome, my dear friends. Yes, please. Anybody? Well, you can also, formulate your questions. You can also email me. I have already sent you an email regarding your term papers. Your deadline is approaching fast. This is my humble submission to all of you. So please take adequate, measures to honor the deadline. If in case of any kind of, emergency, please keep me posted. If you are not in a position to frame your topic, I will frame. And 2 or 3 topics remains to be, framed. Some topics I have, framed, but I have also received a few emails. I think 3 emails are still with me, and I have to respond today. So far, these emails are, concerned. Because of some preoccupations of a medical, nature, I could not respond within the time which I have, designated and stipulated for response. But today I intend to respond to those 3 emails. So thank you very much for the day, my dear friends. Enjoy yourself
Thank you,
and
sir. Take care.
keep yourself busy. And thank you very much for your interventions, for your questions. And I further request you, please ask questions, because questions generate a lot of what we call, academic integration, as well as we are able to locate different, dimensions in our, academic engagements. So thank you very much for the day.
Thank
Okay,
you,
sir.
sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye. Take care.